Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of Ezekiel and Daniel. It's session 8. The text is Daniel 1, verses 8 to 21. The title is Integrity Established. And the lesson summary statement is believers can live with integrity when tempted to compromise. Jack Phillips is a Colorado baker. He was asked by a gay couple if he would bake their wedding cake. And he told them no. Since it was a religious ceremony, it violated his Christian beliefs, and so they sued him. The Colorado Supreme Court said that he had done wrong, and so they ruled in favor of the gay couple. Jack Phillips and his lawyers took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the case was heard, and he won. When the case was accepted by the Supreme Court, Autumn Scardina, a lawyer, called the baker to order a transgender cake, blue on the outside and pink on the inside. Now, why would she do that? She said she wanted to see if he really believed his Christian beliefs. I found this story at foxbusiness.com/lifestyle/Colorado banker sued again over alleged LGBTQ bias. It is dated March 23rd. There are many stories on the internet you'll find where there are school teachers who are losing their job over refusal to use preferred nouns. Maybe there's a girl in the school and she wants to be referred to as him or vice versa. And so there are people who are losing their jobs over this. Do you know of people who are facing serious pressure to compromise some of their fundamental beliefs? And I'd ask that to the class. And I know of people in our class, in our church, who have been faced with this and have had to go through various kinds of training and sensitivity classes for these kinds of things. And so this gives them an opportunity to talk about it. It has put some of our church members in a real difficult situation because it's their job that's at risk. Now, I came across a statement that I want to use as a way to conclude this. Some temptations to compromise are clearly a violation of biblical commands. And believers know they'll commit sin if they yield to those temptations. However, there are situations where a Christian isn't so sure God would disapprove. And this is when a disciplined spiritual life and a developed Christian conscience can find both the wisdom and courage to recognize and resist any spiritual compromise. There is this issue of integrity. Believers can live with integrity when tempted to compromise, and this is becoming a great challenge for believers today. This is our first lesson in the book of Daniel, and so I want to give you an outline that kind of helps see the purpose of Daniel. The first part of Daniel is his ministry, Daniel's ministry, chapters 1 to 6. And the second half is Daniel's visions, chapters 7 to 12. Or another way of putting it is there is a historical section, chapters 1 to 6, and then the prophetic section in chapters 7 to 12. And even though there is a dramatic change in each of the sections in terms of the genre of literature, they all have one particular thing that they're saying, and that is God is in control. The book of Daniel is about the sovereignty of God. So whether it's historical narrative in chapters 1 to 6, or whether it's a prophetic, apocalyptic kind of literature in chapters 7 to 12, the whole book in both sections is emphasizing that God is in control. In spite of appearances, God is sovereign. And one thing we need to just settle with our classes, and Daniel's a good book to point this out. The Bible is about God. And so what Daniel is teaching us is not the story of this amazing individual, but the story behind him, the God behind him. And instead of giving us abstract truth to teach us about God, the Bible takes us and puts us into a relationship with people and we see how God relates to people, and through that we come to see that what we know and understand about God. And Daniel's book is a story of divine sovereignty, and it is given to encourage a beleaguered people. And despite the conditions, the difficult conditions that God's people are in, they can have peace because they know ultimately God is in control. You'll see that in this chapter 1. It's already pointed out for us. So the first point of our lesson is a commitment expressed. And I want to ask the class, if you wanted to assimilate people into your culture, to turn them from whatever they're coming from into, let's say, Americans, what things would you do to pull them away from their culture and to adopt a new culture? There would be things like education, religion, adopting new cultural customs, showing the superiority of your culture over another culture, the wealth of your culture. Those kinds of things can be seen in verses 1 to 7. And you may ask them to glance over 1 to 7 and see what are the things there that the Babylonians do to change these Jewish young men into Babylonians, because that's what the whole effort is. And it is steady and it is relentless in their life to change them from being Jewish into being Babylonian. And what we're going to see is that they don't succeed. These young men stay true to the living God. Now, after that conversation and that kind of setting the background to what's happening for verses 8 through 10, it'd be a time to read the scriptures. You may have them read it or you read it. Maybe you want to give some explanation as you go along. For example, verse 8, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. Now your Leader's Guide gives you a good explanation about this word determined. It was a careful, thought out decision. This wasn't a spur of the moment decision. It was a life of faith decision. He knew that something was going to happen here that would affect his relationship with God. Something about this felt as though he would be sinning against God if he agreed to eat this food and drink this wine. Now, we don't know the reasons. We're not given the reasons why Daniel felt that way. He took the name, a Babylonian name, and he didn't resist that. He's entered into a Babylonian education, and he becomes the valedictorian of his class, so he absolutely learns everything that they give him about that. He doesn't reject that. But there's something about this issue, something about the food and the wine that in Daniel's mind knew that was a line too far for him. Something about that is going to have an impact on his relationship with God. There's things speculation. The food wasn't prepared properly because of dietary laws of the Jewish people. Maybe it was offered to gods before it was given to them, and so there would be a way of acknowledging the gods of the Babylonians. Or maybe somehow it was entered into a relationship with the Babylonian king. But whatever the issue is, there was something there that Daniel felt this was going to be a sin against God. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. And the words convey politeness and tactfulness as he approaches this man. Verse 9, God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. You already begin to see that God is at work. Daniel no doubt had a pleasant personality, and there was something about him that was charming. And this man had a kindness, this compassion. Maybe he felt something of what it would be like for this young teenage man to be pulled away from his family, to be pulled away from his nation, and to just be thrown into this kind of culture. There may have been something of that, but whatever it was, God gave this man a friendliness, a sensitivity towards Daniel. Verse 10, Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your face looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. That reveals how courageous and how bold is Daniel's request. He asks something of this man that this man says, if this doesn't go well, or if the king finds out I haven't obeyed him, I could very well lose my life. And so it tells you something of how powerful this issue is that's going on. Now, how far should a Christian separate himself from activities in which people of the world participate? I mean, there is liberty in Christ, but there's also limits to one's Christian liberty. So, I'm asking the class, what about this situation where Daniel is not in control? What are the issues where he's not in control? He's not in control of his education. He's not in control of the name that they give him. He's not in control of the geography, the place where he lives. He's not in control of the assignment that he's placed there in the king's court. There are a number of things in which these are things that are out of Daniel's control. Well, then, in light of that, what concessions does Daniel make? Well, he accepts the Babylonian name. It's interesting, in the book of Daniel, later when the king comes to him and inquires of him, when he's in the lion's den, he doesn't refer to Daniel's Babylonian name, he refers to Daniel's Jewish name. But he accepts that. He accepts the education, and there are other things that he accepts about the Babylonian. He accepts the place where God's placed him in terms of influence in the king's palace. There are things that are out of his control. He has no choice about it. There are things where he does concede and accept these things. But then where does he make a commitment? He draws a line that simply couldn't be crossed. He recognizes that the drift towards being secular instead of centered on God is a relentless drift. And the only thing that will keep him from drifting away from his God is a rock-solid commitment, a conviction. So, whatever the case is, whatever the issue is, when it came to this food matter, this is something that Daniel said, if I submit to this, I'm going to sin against God, and I'm going to be drifting away from Him being the center of my life. A question that I like to ask to prepare them for maybe a deeper question is to ask a question a little bit broader, and that is to just ask the question, what would be those central convictions for our church? These are things that despite what our culture, despite what our community says, we will not give these things up as God's people at Northeast Baptist. And so we could talk about that. And then I could go from that to say, well, as an individual Christian, what are some of those convictions? And of course, they should be representing the same. So there is a commitment expressed. And in order for Christians to live in this world, we must recognize there's this constant and relentless influence to move away from our basic convictions. But there needs to come a point where, come what may, this is where we stand as Christian people. A commitment tested. Believers can live with integrity when tempted to compromise. That will be tested. The second point is a test passed. And so I'm going to read this with just some explanation. And this is just simply an ingenious plan that Daniel comes up with. It circumvents any of the issues about meat and drink. And it avoids this constant meal-by-meal scrimmage about whether you should eat this or whether you should drink that. It's just ingenious. Just give us vegetables. Now, please understand what's happening here is we're not being given a diet plan. I know there's something out there called the Daniel diet, and I don't know anything about that, but the point that's here is this is not a diet in which we're to adopt as believers. What's happening is God is using this to show He's in control. So, verse 11, so Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So this is a lesser person. It's not the chief eunuch. This is someone who's going to be distributing the food. And he says to him, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see." He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. Now, there's always this effort to try to explain this. Did 10 days mean 10 days, or was it just a short period of time? Well, we're not certain about that, but because later it says that they're 10 times better than everybody else, and obviously that was a way of just saying they stand head and shoulders above. They're at the top of the class. They're in a different category altogether. But the point here is not to emphasize the time frame. The point is that God did a work in the life of Daniel and his friends as they exercised trust in God. Maybe it did have something to do with this diet was more familiar to Daniel and his friends, and the others were eating richer food, and that somehow had a negative impact to their system. And that explains why Daniel looks healthier and he's stronger, and he's ahead of the others in the group. But the bottom line is their faithfulness to God is what God honors to show that He is in control. Now just imagine, here's this man for 10 days. He withholds this rich food. I mean, it's the very best of the best. This is what the king is eating. And these young men get this. Can you imagine how wonderful that food must have been? And yet they are settled with vegetables and bread and water. And at the end of this time period, Daniel and his friends are obviously, distinctively healthier than the others. Now the chief guard is going to wonder, how is this possible? And think about the people who are preparing the meal. And they come to an understanding that Daniel and his friends are eating vegetables and bread instead of this wonderful, rich food. It had to get around, what is going on here? How is this happening? Why are they so superior? And it was one more way of saying, it's not the Babylonian God that's in charge. It is Judah's God. Now, he approaches him with tact and discretion, and yet he can hold to his biblical convictions. And what we find is this is attractive to the man rather than offending the man. So we can go through the text and have an explanation and interact as a class. And then I was going to ask the class, how has your faith been tested? And sometimes it's good to have an example to just kind of get the thing rolling. When I first became a Christian, I was working in the oil field, and I would work on the weekends, and I delivered tools to rigs. It's called a hotshot service. And so it was very important that when I got home from school, and I had a family to provide for, that I stayed busy that weekend. And so there were a number of times on Sunday morning, I was getting dressed to go to church, and I'd get a call, and I'd have to undress and put on my work clothes and deliver tools to rigs on Sunday morning. Well, it began to grieve me and distress me about my walk with God. I felt so strongly the need for worship and to be with God's people, to be taught the Word of God. So I went to my father that I worked with on this, and he was not a believer at the time. And I said, Dad, I need to go to church on Sunday morning. And I said, so after church on Sunday morning, if you want to run me all over Oklahoma and Texas, I'll do that. But I said, I really do need to go to church on Sunday. And my father respected that. Well, the next weekend, when we came home from school and I was going to work, there was no work. There was no work on Friday. There was no work on Saturday. There was no work on Sunday. And I remember driving home thinking, am I going to be able to maintain this? Because I need to work to provide for my family. But it was just that one weekend. God knew I didn't have a strong faith, but He tested it, and God provided for me and my family in a wonderful way. And so I'm asking them, has your faith been tested like that? And for people to share that. Then, after that time, I'm going to ask, how did the test strengthen your resolve? Or what did it reveal to you about God? I learned that this God is a God of provision. I learned that you can trust Him, that He will provide for you. So that's a way to get at this second point. The third point is a recognized difference. A simple act of trust is what reveals God. Now notice what he says in verse 17. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding and every kind of literature and wisdom. The word gave is also used in verse 7, where it talks about that they were given names, Babylonian names, and it's a strong word. In verse 7, those Babylonian names were given for the purpose of erasing their Jewish heritage and their background in order to make them Babylonians. And so what it's wanting you to understand here is these were bright young men, but their knowledge, their understanding of the literature and the wisdom of Babylon was just simply on a different level than the other men that were being trained for this position. And the writer wants you to know it is an act of God that these men had this. And then he tells us that Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. And we'll see later in the book of Daniel why that is so important. Because the Babylonians used visions and dreams. They felt that was a very powerful way that the gods were trying to speak to us. And it says Daniel had an unusual ability when it came to properly understanding those things. Verse 18, at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. So here they are being tested by the king. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend to the king. Now catch what the writer is saying here. These young men have been taken away from their nation. And in the mindset of the people of that day, the Babylonian God was stronger than the Jewish God because he had conquered the land of Judah. But who is it that's going to stand in the presence of the king and advise him on his decisions? It's these Jewish young men. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Then this last verse, this is not a throwaway verse, listen to this. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So he goes through the reigns of 3 Babylonian kings, and then also he's there for the reign of the first Persian king. What is the writer wanting us to understand? Daniel's ministry is somewhere between 65 to 70 years. Daniel may have actually been a part of drawing up the papers to send the Jewish people back to the land of Babylon. Here is this great invincible power in 605 BC that is just knocking down the nations like dominoes. It seemed to be invincible. And yet what happens 70 years later? That nation is gone. And who is it that's standing in the place of power? A Jew, Daniel. And he's advising these men. He outlasted the Babylonian Empire. And now he's having an influence on the next empire, the Persians. And the Persians are the one that released the Jews to go back to the home. What is it that he's saying? There is a sovereign God that's in charge. And regardless of the background and how dark it may be, he is still in control. This sovereign God protects Daniel, for he survives during all of those times. Now, here's a question I have for the class. What difference should be recognized in a Christian employee? What difference should be recognized in a Christian boss? What difference should be recognized in a Christian family? Because the point is a recognized difference. There was something distinctive about Daniel. And the scriptures are making clear it was because of his devotion to God. To conclude the lesson, I found a story of a Southern Baptist missionary, a Dr. Meyer. And she is found at the Alabama History. The website is www.awhf.org/myers.htm. I'm going to give them a copy of the story of this doctor and how God used her to be a witness in Yemen. She was martyred there. And the man who killed her intended to stop her Christian witness. But what he actually did was he broadcast her witness around the world. The point is, God's in control. And the truth of the matter is that believers can live with integrity when tempted to compromise. This is a real live lesson and an issue for many of the people who will be in your Sunday school class because of the things they're facing outside of the church, in their place of work, maybe in their family and their friendships. So God bless you for teaching this lesson.